Learning jazz guitar, then you've probably already discovered that some skills are a lot more difficult to internalize and also hard to improve with exercises in the same way that you can practice scales and arpeggios. This video is really about all the things that you're going to learn if you start working on bebop themes. And to paraphrase a famous guitar player, learn bebop themes and let the bebop themes teach you. Let me know in the comments if you know who I'm talking about here. When I'm talking about bebop themes in this video, then I'm referring to the types of melodies that you find in pieces by people like Charlie Parker, John Lewis, Bud Powell and others. Usually they're written on standard progressions and especially often on blues and rhythm changes. To name a few famous examples, Donna Lee, which is probably actually by Miles Davis, of course Charlie Parker's Anthropology, or Dizzy Gillespie's Groovin' High. What is great about bebop themes is that essentially there are melodies that are written out bebop solos. So the melody in a bebop theme is similar to a bebop solo and not a vocal melody as you might find in a jazz standard from the Great American Songbook. The immediate bonus here is that when you learn a bebop theme, then you're studying something that's very close to a solo and really getting that type of melody and phrasing into your ears and fingers. One of the best ways to improve phrasing and vocabulary is of course to learn solos by ear. You've heard me say it a lot, and you've probably also heard countless others say this all the time. The problem with this is that solos are long, they don't repeat that many things, and they're difficult to both learn and remember. Since bebop themes are complicated melodies similar to bebop solos, then they're not as easy to memorize or play as a normal jazz standard melody, but the fact that the theme is a lot shorter and also often has more repetition means that learning bebop themes is a bit like a fast food version of transcribing, and unlike most fast food, it's actually good for you. So if you're new to learning jazz solos by ear, what we call transcribing, even though there's not necessarily any writing involved, an easy way to get started is to learn some bebop themes by ear. There are quite a few things that you develop by playing bebop themes. Let's have a look at some of those benefits. When you're playing this type of vocabulary, then you have to figure out how to execute some pretty difficult music. And obviously that's good for your technique. And while figuring out how you can play the phrases, then you're most likely going to move around a bit on the neck and find a practical place where you can actually play the phrase. And in that way, it is also extremely useful for your fretboard knowledge. Studying and learning bebop lines, and especially when you also, of course, are checking out recordings of the song, is going to develop your phrasing. Playing along with a recording and really listening to how a piece of music is phrased is probably the most efficient way to learn phrasing. And I've used bebop themes for myself, but certainly also for my students with great success when it comes to improve phrasing and start sounding more like bebop. Another exercise that I also see work really well is to write easy solos for students and teach them to play it along with a recording of it. This is also a major part of what I use for the students in my course, the Jazz Guitar Roadmap. One thing is to understand what to play, but it's much more useful to hear it and to experience how it feels to play it with good phrasing. My friends over at the Guitar Hour podcast are often discussing what studying vocabulary and language actually is. And in general, that's one of the things I like about that podcast. They take a critical look at how you learn things and how we think about things. And it is a term that does not always mean the same thing from lesson to lesson or teacher to teacher. So to me, the point of developing your vocabulary is that you can create and play lines or melodies that sound in style for a specific genre, in this case, bebop. So when you're working on vocabulary, then you're hopefully taking melodies and licks and using them to help you get better and improvising in that same style. That does not have to mean that you're playing licks all the time, but it's more about learning the language or style by example, which is not far from how we learn actual languages.
¿Dónde está la biblioteca?
From this point of view, then playing bebop themes will expose you to those phrases and you're internalizing examples of how those melodies sound and how they work, which will help you hear phrases like that internally, something that's a part of being able to play solos in that style. But not the only thing you need to do. If you stick with the language analogy, then I would describe this as being able to listen to a language and understand it, but not being able to speak it. In fact, that's how I learned Dutch, with an odd period in the middle where I understood most things, but I could never really take part in a conversation because my Dutch was completely passive. And if you like podcasts, then check out the Guitar Hour podcast for some interesting discussions about pretty much anything guitar related. They are often what I spend time listening to when I'm driving longer trips, and I'm not only saying this because I won their yearly or their end of the year quiz for the second time in a row. In fact, I'm probably the only one who has ever won that quiz. A huge part of what is practical about bebop themes is that they're shorter than solos and generally also more repetitive. This means that there's simply less information to learn, but they still have really important and really useful information. If you learn the theme by ear, then you don't have to worry about mistakes in real books or omnibooks, and while it may seem more difficult in the beginning, then the time that you need to spend listening to it to figure out what they're playing will probably mean that you're learning to play it a lot faster, because you already know what it sounds like. Using the ability that we have now to slow down recordings can also be very helpful, but watch out that you don't overdo it so that you only listen for a single note when you should really be listening for the entire phrase. This is also often overlooked when it comes to checking out transcriptions versus learning solos by ear. If you learn it by ear, then you don't really have to worry that much about learning how to play it. Now you already know how studying bebop themes will help your phrasing, technique, and ear training. But of course, it can also be put to use to develop your vocabulary. The melody is a bebop solo used as a theme, so analyzing, studying, and using it as licks can be very useful, especially if you can find small fragments that you can make variations of and turn into completely new vocabulary that's your own. It can also be very useful to start analyzing the melody and understand some of the melodic techniques used, since there are quite a few things that are very typical to bebop that you can check out and learn to use to create your own licks. If you want to check out a video on how one of the best sounding melodic tricks in bebop work, then check out this video on octave displacement, how it applies to phrasing, and how it works with chromaticism. All things that you need if you want your solos to sound more like real bebop.